So the way that we've been thinking about this is like a really modularized implementation, right? Where in our computational graph, right, we look at each node locally and we compute the local gradients and chain them with the upstream gradients coming down. And so you can think of this as basically a forward and a backwards API, right? In the forward pass, we implement a function computing the output of this node, and then in the backwards pass, we compute the gradient, right? And so when we actually implement this in code, we're going to do this in exactly the same way. We can basically think about for each gate, right, if we implement a forward function and a backward function, where the backward function is computing the chain rule, then if we have our entire graph, we can just make a forward pass through the entire graph by iterating through all the nodes in the graph, all the gates. Here I'm going to use the word gate and node kind of interchangeably. We can iterate through all of these gates and just call forward on each of the gates, right? And we just want to do this in topologically sorted order, so we process all of the inputs coming into a node before we process that node. And then going backwards, we're just going to then go through all of the gates in this reverse sorted order and then call backwards on each of these gates. Okay, and so if we look at then the implementation for a particular gate, so for example, this multiply gate here, we want to implement the forward pass, right? So it gets x and y as inputs and returns the value of z. And then when we go backwards, right, we get as input dz, which is our upstream gradient, and we want to output the gradients on the inputs x and y to pass down, right? So we're going to output dx and dy. And so in this case, in this example, everything is back to the scalar case here. And so if we look at this in the forward pass, one thing that's important is that we should cache the values of the forward pass, right? Because we end up using this in the backward pass a lot of the time. So here in the forward pass, we want to cache the values of x and y, right? And in the backward pass, using the chain rule, we're going to remember, take the value of the upstream gradient and scale it by the value of the other branch, right? And so we'll keep, for dx, we'll take our value of self.y that we kept and multiply it by dz coming down. And same for dy. Okay, so if you look at a lot of deep learning frameworks and libraries, you'll see that they exactly follow this kind of modularization, right? So for example, Caffe is a popular deep learning framework, and you'll see if you go look through the Caffe source code, you'll get to some directory that says layers, and in layers, which are basically computational nodes, usually layers might be slightly more, some of these more complex computational nodes like the sigmoid that we talked about earlier, you'll see basically just a whole list of all different kinds of computational nodes, right? So you might have the sigmoid, I don't know, there might be here, there's like a convolution is one, there's and argmax is another layer. You'll have all of these layers, and if you dig into each of them, they're just exactly implementing a forward pass and a backward pass. And then all of these are called when we do forward and backward pass through the entire network that we form. And so our network is just basically going to be stacking up all of these, the different layers that we choose to use in the network. So for example, if we look at a specific one, in this case, a sigmoid layer, you'll see that in the sigmoid layer, right, we've talked about the sigmoid function. You'll see that there's a forward pass, which basically computes exactly the sigmoid expression, and then a backward pass, right, where it is taking as input something, basically a top diff, which is our upstream gradient in this case, and multiplying it by a local gradient that we compute. So in assignment 1, you'll get practice with this kind of computational graph way of thinking, where you're going to be writing your SVM and softmax losses and taking the gradients of these. And so again, remember always you want to first step represent it as a computational graph, right? Figure out what are all the computations that you did leading up to the output, and then when it's time to do your backward pass, just take the gradient with respect to each of these intermediate variables that you've defined in your computational graph, and use the chain rule to link them all together. Okay, so summary of what we've talked about so far. when we get down to working with neural networks, these are going to be really large and complex. So it's going to be impractical to write down the gradient formula by hand for all your parameters. So in order to get these gradients, right, we talked about how what we should use is backpropagation, right? And this is kind of one of the core techniques of neural networks, is basically using backpropagation to get your gradients, right? And so this is a recursive application of the chain rule where we have this computational graph, and we start at the back and we go backwards through it to compute the gradients with respect to all of the intermediate variables, which are your inputs, your parameters, and everything else in the middle. And we've also talked about how really this implementation in this graph structure, each of these nodes is really, you can see this as implementing a forward and backwards API, right? And so in the forward pass, we want to compute the results of the operation, and we want to save any intermediate values that we might want to use later in our gradient computation. And then in the backwards pass, we apply this chain rule, and we take this upstream gradient, we chain it, multiply it with our local gradient to compute the gradient with respect to the inputs of the node, and we pass this down to the nodes that are connected next. Okay, so now finally we're going to talk about neural networks. Right? So really, neural networks. People draw a lot of analogies between neural networks and the brain and different types of biological inspirations, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about it. Just looking at it as a function, as a class of functions, without all of the without all the brain stuff. So far we've talked about. We've worked a lot with this linear score function, right? F equals W times X. And so we've been using this as a running example of a function that we want to optimize. So instead of using this single linear transformation, if we want a neural network, right, we can just, as the simplest form, just stack two of these together, right? Just a linear transformation on top of another one in order to get a two-layer neural network, right? And so what this looks like is first we have our, a matrix multiply of W1 with X, and then we get this intermediate variable, and we have this nonlinear function of a max of 0 with max with this output of this linear layer. And it's really important to have these nonlinearities in place, which we'll talk about more later, because otherwise, if you just stack linear layers on top of each other, they're just going to collapse to like a single linear function. Okay, so we have our first linear layer, and then we have this nonlinearity, right? And then on top of this, we'll add another linear layer. And then from here, finally, we can get our score function, or our output vector of scores. So basically, like more broadly speaking, neural networks are a class of functions where we have simpler functions, right, that are stacked on top of each other. And we stack them in a hierarchical way in order to make up a more complex nonlinear function. And so this is the idea of having basically multiple stages of hierarchical computation, right? And so so this is kind of the main way that we do this is by taking something like this matrix multiply, this linear layer, and we just stack multiple of these on top of each other with the nonlinear functions in between, right? And so one thing that this can help solve is if we remember back to this linear score function that we were talking about, right? Remember we discussed earlier how each row of our weight matrix W was something like a template, right? It was a template that sort of expressed, what we're looking for in the input for a specific class, right? So for example, the car template looks something like this kind of fuzzy red car, and we were looking for this in the input to compute the score for the car class, right? And we talked about one of the problems with this is that there's only one template, right? There's this red car, whereas in practice, we actually have multiple modes, right? We're looking for, a red car, there's also a yellow car, like all of these are different kinds of cars. And so what this kind of multiple layer network lets you do is now, each of this intermediate variable H, right? W1 can still be these kinds of templates. But now you have all of these scores for these templates in H, and we can have another layer on top that's combining these together, right? So it can say that actually my car class should be, connected to, we're looking for both red cars as well as yellow cars, right? Because we have this matrix W2, which is now a weighting of all of our vector in H. So W1, because it's directly connected to the input X, this is what's like really interpretable, right? Because you can formulate all of these templates. W2, so H is going to be a score of how much of each template you saw, for example, right? So it might be like you have, like a, I don't know, 2 for the red car and like 1 for the yellow car or something like that. Exactly. So the question is basically whether in W1 you could have both left-facing horse and right-facing horse, right? And so yeah, exactly. So now W1 can be many different kinds of templates, right? They're not, and then W2 now basically is a weighted sum of all of these templates. So now it allows you to weight together multiple templates in order to get the final score for a particular class. Right. So okay. So the question is, if our image X is like a left-facing horse, and in W1 we have a template of a left-facing horse and a right-facing horse, then what's happening, right? So what happens is, yeah. So in H you might have a really high score for your left-facing horse, kind of a lower score for your right-facing horse, and W2 is it's a weighted sum, so it's not a maximum. It's a weighted sum of these templates. But if you have either a really high score for one of these templates, or let's say you have kind of a medium score for both of these templates, all of these kinds of combinations are going to give high scores, right? And so in the end, what you're going to get is something that generally scores high when you have a horse of any kind. W2 is doing the weighting. So the question is W2 doing the weighting or is H doing the weighting? H is the value, like in this example, H is the value of scores for each of your templates that you have in W1. Right, so H is like the score function, right? It's how much of each template in W1 is present, and then W2 is going to weight all of these intermediate scores to get your final score for the class. So the question is, which is a nonlinear thing? So the nonlinearity usually happens right before H. So H is the value right after the nonlinearity. So we're talking about this like, intuitively as this example of like W1 is looking for, has these same templates as before, and W2 is awaiting for these. In practice, it's not exactly like this, right? Because as you said, there's all these nonlinearities thrown in and so on, but it has this approximate type of interpretation to it. Yeah. So the question is H just W1x. So H is just W1 times x with the max function on top. So we've talked about this as an example of a 2-layer neural network, and we can stack more layers of these to get deeper networks of arbitrary depth, right? So we can just do this one more time, add another max nonlinearity, and matrix multiply now by W3, and now we have a 3-layer neural network, right? And so this is where the term deep neural networks is basically coming from, right? This idea that you can stack multiple of these layers, for very deep. And so in homework, you'll get a practice of writing and training one of these neural networks, I think in assignment 2. But basically a full implementation of this using this idea of forward pass, right, and backward passes, and using chain rule to compute gradients that we've already seen. The entire implementation of a 2-layer neural network is actually really simple. It can just be done in 20 lines. And so you'll get some practice with this in assignment 2. Writing out all of these parts. And okay, so now that we've sort of seen what neural networks are as a function, right? Like, we hear people talking a lot about how there's biological inspirations for neural networks, and so even though it's important to emphasize that these analogies are really loose. It's really just very loose ties. But it's still interesting to understand where some of these connections and inspirations come from. And so now I'm going to talk briefly about that. So if we think about a neuron in kind of a very simple way, this neuron here's a diagram of a neuron. We have the impulses that are carried towards each neuron, right? So we have a lot of neurons connected together. And each neuron has dendrites, right? And these are what receives the impulses that come into the neuron. And then we have a cell body, right, that basically integrates these signals coming in. And then there's a kind of, then it takes this, and after integrating all of these signals, it passes on, the impulse carries away from the cell body to downstream neurons that it's connected to, right? And it carries this away through axons. So now if we look at what we've been doing so far, right, with each computational node, you can see that this actually you can see it in kind of a similar way, right, where nodes are connected to each other in the computational graph, and we have inputs or signals x, right, coming into a neuron. And then all of these x, right, x0, x1, x2, these are combined and integrated together, right, using, for example, our weights W, right? So we do some sort of computation, right? In some of the computations we've been doing so far, something like W times X plus B, so, right, integrating all of these together. And then we have an activation function that we apply on top. We get this value of this output, and we pass it down to the connecting neurons. So if you look about this is actually, you can think about this in a very similar way, right? Like, these are what's the signals coming in are kind of the connected at synapses, right? The synapse connecting the multiple neurons. The dendrites are integrating all of these. They're integrating all of this information together in the cell body, and then we have the output carried on the output later on. And so this is kind of the analogy that you can draw between them. And if you look at these activation functions, right, this is what basically takes all the inputs coming in and outputs one number that's going out later on. And we've talked about examples like sigmoid activation function, right, and different kinds of nonlinearities. And so sort of one kind of loose analogy that you can draw is that these nonlinearities can represent something sort of like the firing or spiking rate of the neurons, right? Where neurons are transmit signals to connected neurons using kind of these discrete spikes, right? And so we can think of, if they're spiking very, very fast, then there's kind of a strong signal that's passed later on. And so we can think of this value after our activation function as sort of, in a sense, sort of this firing rate that we're going to pass on. And in practice, I think neuroscientists who are actually studying this say that kind of one of the nonlinearities that are most similar to the way that neurons are actually behaving is a ReLU function, which is a ReLU nonlinearity, which is something that we're going to look at more later on. But it's a function that's 0 for all negative values of input, and then it's a linear function for everything that's in kind of the positive regime. And so, we'll talk more about this activation function later on, but that's kind of, in practice, maybe the one that's most similar to how neurons are actually behaving. But it's really important to be extremely careful with making any of these sorts of brain analogies, because in practice, biological neurons are way more complex than this. There's many different kinds of biological neurons. The dendrites can perform really complex nonlinear computations. Our synapses, right, the W0s that we had earlier, or we drew this analogy, are not single weights like we had. They're actually really complex, nonlinear dynamical systems in practice. And also this idea of interpreting our activation function as a sort of rate code or firing rate is also is insufficient in practice. It's just this kind of firing rate is probably not a sufficient model of how neurons will actually communicate to downstream neurons, right? Like even as a very simple way, the neurons will fire at a variable rate, and this variability probably should be taken into account. And so there's all of these, it's kind of a much more complex thing than what we're dealing with. There's references, for example, this dendritic computation that you can look at if you're interested in this topic. But in practice, we can sort of see how it may resemble a neuron at this very high level, but neurons are in practice much more complicated than that. Okay, so we talked about how there's many different kinds of activation functions that could be used. There's the ReLU that I mentioned earlier. And we'll talk about all of these different kinds of activation functions in much more detail later on, choices of these activation functions that you might want to use. And so we'll also talk about different kinds of neural network architectures. So we gave the example of these fully connected neural networks, right, where each layer is this matrix multiply. And so the way we actually want to call these is we said 2-layer neural network before, and that corresponded to the fact that we have 2 of these linear layers, right, where we're doing a matrix multiply. 2 fully connected layers is what we call these. We could also call this a 1 hidden layer neural network. So instead of counting the number of matrix multiplies we're doing, counting the number of hidden layers that we have. I think it's you can use either. I think maybe 2-layer neural network is something that's a little more commonly used. And then also here for our 3-layer neural network that we have, this can also be called a 2 hidden layer neural network. We saw that when we're doing this type of feed forward, right, forward pass through a neural network, each of these nodes in this network is basically doing the kind of operation of the neuron that I showed earlier, right? And so what's actually happening is it's basically each hidden layer you can think of as a whole vector, right? A set of these neurons. And so by writing it out this way with these matrix multiplies to compute our neuron values, it's a way that we can efficiently evaluate this entire layer of neurons, right? So with 1 matrix multiply, we get output values of a layer of, let's say, 10 or 50 or 100 of neurons, right? And so just looking at this again, writing this all out in matrix form, matrix vector form, we have our nonlinearity here, f, that we're using in this case, the sigmoid function, right? And we can take our data x, some input vector or of values, and we can apply our first matrix multiply, W1 on top of this, then our nonlinearity, then a second matrix multiply to get a second hidden layer H2, and then we have our final output, right? And so this is basically all you need to be able to write a neural network. And as we saw earlier, the backward pass, you then just use backprop to compute all of those. And so that's basically all there is to kind of the main idea of what's a neural network. Okay, so just to summarize, we talked about how we can arrange neurons into these computations, right, of fully connected or linear layers. This abstraction of a layer has a nice property that we can use very efficient vectorized code to compute all of these. We also talked about how it's important to keep in mind that neural networks do have some analogy and loose inspiration from biology, but they're not really neural. I mean, this is a pretty loose analogy that we're making. And next time we'll talk about convolutional neural networks. Okay, thanks.
컴퓨테이셔널 그래프는 모듈러라이즈된 임플리멘테이션으로 구현할 수 있습니다. 포워드와 백워드 API로 구성되는데 포워드 API는 인풋을 인풋 게이트로 패스해서 포워드 프로포게이션을 합니다. 백워드는 그레디언트를 백워드 프로포게이션을 합니다. 다음은 멀티플라이 게이트의 클래스입니다. 포워드 프로포게이션에서는 x와 y를 인풋으로 받아서 c값을 계산한 뒤 이를 리턴합니다. 반면에 backward propagation에서는 upstream gradient인 c에 대한 gradient l을 인풋으로 해서 x에 대한 gradient l과 y에 대한 gradient l을 리턴합니다. backward propagation에서는 계산을 하기 위해서 x와 y 값이 필요하기 때문에 forward propagation에서 이를 sep.x와 sep.y로 저장하는 코딩이 추가되었습니다. 모듈러라이제이션의 사례로 카펫 레이어 등이 있는데 온갖 종류의 컴퓨테이셔널 노드들이 리스트되어 있는 것을 볼 수 있습니다. 만일 여러분들이 딥러닝 프로그램을 짠다면 처음부터 모든 것을 시작하는 것이 아니라 이러한 레이어에 있는 것들을 레고 블록처럼 가져다가 조립함으로써 코딩을 하게 됩니다. 예를 들어서 우리는 이전에 시그모이드 펑션에 대해서 학습했는데 카페에는 시그모이드 레이어가 있습니다. 파란색 박스는 forward propagation을 나타내고 빨간색 박스는 upstream gradient에 대한 backward propagation을 나타냅니다. 다음은 스탠포드 강의에서 추천하는 어사인먼트입니다. SVM과 소프트맥스 코딩을 작성하는 것인데 컴퓨테이셔널 그래프를 코드로 전환해 보는 것입니다. 본 수업에서는 여러분들이 자유롭게 과제를 선정하기 때문에 꼭 이 코딩을 하실 필요는 없습니다. 파란색 선은 score라는 intermediate node로서 f equal wx로 구현할 수 있습니다. margin은 노란색 선으로서 max 값을 구현하는 것입니다. 데이터 로스는 이러한 margin을 summation 한 것입니다. reg loss는 regularization을 뜻하는 것으로서 RW를 계산하는 것입니다. 로스는 데이터 로스에 이 reg loss를 더한 값입니다. 이러한 forward pass를 통해서 loss 값을 구하면 backward pass를 통해서 d-margin 값을 구하고 d-score 값을 구하고 dw 값을 구하게 됩니다. 지금까지 배운 내용을 요약하면 다음과 같습니다. 뉴럴넷은 매우 클 수 있기 때문에 모든 파라미터에 대해서 그레디언트 포뮬러를 작성하는 것은 비현실적입니다. backpropagation은 컴퓨테이셔널 그래프를 따라서 체인 룰을 리커시브하게 적용하는 것입니다. 모든 인풋 파라미터, intermediate에 대해서 그레디언트 값들을 계산합니다. implementation은 그래프 스트럭처를 가지고 있는데 forward와 backward API를 각 노드에 implementation 합니다. forward에서는 오퍼레이션 값들을 계산한 뒤 gradient computation을 위해서 intermediate 값들을 저장합니다. backward에서는 input에 대한 loss function의 gradient를 계산하기 위해서 chain 룰을 사용합니다. 지금까지 배운 내용을 기반으로 뉴럴 네트워크에 대해서 배우도록 하겠습니다. 뉴럴 네트워크는 브레인이라는 biological inspiration에서 시작됐는데 사실 브레인이 동작하는 방법과는 다릅니다. 여기서는 브레인에 대한 것들 없이 뉴럴 네트워크에 대해서 설명을 하도록 하겠습니다. 우리는 지금까지 f equal w times x라는 linear scope 펑션에 대해서 다루었습니다. 그리고 backpropagation을 통해서 w 값을 옵티마이즈 하는 것에 대해서 배웠습니다. 이번에는 다음과 같은 두 계층의 뉴럴 네트워크를 구현해 보도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째로 input x에 대해서 w1 times x라는 linear function을 적용해서 intermediate variable h 값을 얻도록 합니다. 다음 단계에서는 nonlinear function max를 적용하고 matrix w2를 곱하여 score 값 s를 얻도록 합니다. 여기서 input image x는 3072개의 디멘전을 갖고 intermediate variable h는 100개의 디멘전을, output s는 10개의 디멘전 혹은 클래스를 갖는 것을 알 수 있습니다. 뉴럴 네트워크는 이처럼 간단한 함수들이 레고 블록처럼 합쳐져서 전체의 시스템을 이룹니다. input matrix w는 템플릿과 같은 역할을 하는데 인풋에서 어떤 것을 찾고 있는지를 보여줍니다. 예를 들면 왼쪽에서 두 번째 흐릿한 빨간색의 차의 템플릿은 인풋에서 차의 클래스를 찾고 있는 것입니다. 또한 오른쪽에서 세 번째 홀스 템플릿은 인풋에서 홀스를 찾고 있습니다. 그러나 문제는 자동차나 홀스나 기타 클래스들이 하나의 템플릿으로 대표될 수 없다는 데 있습니다. 이러한 문제를 해결하기 위해서 W1에서는 이러한 템플릿들을 대표하도록 하고 W2에서는 이러한 템플릿들을 컴바인 하도록 역할을 부여할 수 있습니다. 즉 W2가 H의 벡터를 웨이팅하여 score S를 계산하도록 하는 것입니다. 우리는 이러한 레이어 스태킹을 반복하여 2개, 3개 혹은 100개 이상까지도 구현할 수 있습니다. 파이썬에서 numpy를 임포트해서 다음과 같은 2레이어 뉴럴 네트워크를 만드는 것은 대략 20줄 내외면 가능합니다. 스탠포드 강의에서는 2레이어 뉴럴 네트워크에 코딩을 하는 것을 두 번째 어사이먼트로 하고 있는데, 본 강의에서는 어떤 과제를 하는지는 여러분의 자유 선택입니다. 이것은 뉴럴 네트워크가 우리 뇌에서 동작하는 것을 3D 이미지로 표현한 것입니다. Artificial Neural Network이 인간 뇌에서 Biological Inspiration을 받기는 했지만 그에 대한 애널로지, 유추는 그렇게 크지 않습니다. 생물학적으로 뉴런이 동작하는 방식입니다. 먼저 임펄스가 덴드라이트를 거쳐서 셀 바디로 전달이 됩니다. 임펄스는 엑선을 통과해서 프리시냅틱 터미널에 다다른 뒤 시냅스를 통과하여 다음 뉴런에 전달됩니다. 이러한 뉴런의 동작을 Artificial Neural Network에서는 다음과 같은 컴퓨테이셔널 그래프로 표현할 수 있습니다. 여기서 X0는 엑선을 통과해서 프리시냅틱 터미널에 다다른 신호입니다. X0는 시냅스에서 웨이트 W0가 곱해지고 덴드라이트를 거쳐서 셀 바디에 전달됩니다. 셀 바디에는 여러 개의 덴드라이트가 연결되어 있기 때문에 이를 식으로 표현하면 시그마 WI XI 플러스 B가 됩니다. F는 이에 대한 액티베이션 펑션으로 아웃풋을 만들어냅니다. 본 사례에서는 시그모이드 액티베이션 펑션이 사용되었는데 1 나누기 1 더하기 2의 마이너스 X승입니다. 이러한 브레인의 애널로지를 사용할 때 주의해야 됩니다. 바이올로지컬 뉴런은 여러가지 다른 타입들을 갖고 있습니다. 덴드라이트는 매우 복잡한 non-linear computation 을 수행할 수 있습니다. 시냅스는 하나의 웨이트가 아닐 수 있습니다. 뉴런을 파이링하는 코드는 뇌를 묘사하는데 충분하지 않습니다. 액티베이션 펑션에는 소개한 시그모이드 외에도 여러 다른 방법들이 있습니다. 리키 렐루, 탄젠트 하이볼릭, 맥사, 렐루, ELU 등이 있습니다. 각각에 대한 장단점은 좀 더 많은 지식이 쌓이게 되면 자연스럽게 이해할 수 있습니다. 다음은 간단한 뉴럴 네트워크 아키텍처의 예들입니다. 왼쪽에는 2레이어 뉴럴 넷 혹은 한 개의 히든 레이어 뉴럴 넷이 있습니다. 오른쪽에는 3레이어 뉴럴 넷 혹은 두 개의 히든 레이어 뉴럴 넷이 있습니다. fully connected 레이어는 각 레이어 간마다 노드 간에 완전한 연결이 존재하는 것입니다. 다음은 뉴럴 네트워크의 feed forward computation의 사례입니다. 벡터와 매트릭스를 통해서 매우 간단하게 표현할 수 있습니다. 다음은 3레이어 뉴럴 네트워크의 forward pass를 코딩한 것입니다. 서머리입니다. 뉴런을 fully connected 레이어로 연결합니다. 좀 더 어드밴스된 과정에 가면 partially connected 레이어도 존재합니다. 레이어의 abstraction은 우리가 효율적인 vectorized 코드를 사용할 수 있게 해줍니다. 뉴럴 네트워크는 생물학적인 뉴런에서 인스피레이션을 받았지만 실제 뉴런과는 다릅니다. 다음 시간에는 컨볼루셔널 뉴럴 네트워크에 대해서 다루도록 하겠습니다.